Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The World Turned Upside Down, A History of the Chinese Cultural Revolution by Jisheng. Translated and edited by Stacy Mosher and Guo Jian. Narrated by Nancy Wu. Publisher's note. This audiobook refers to maps, graphs, and tables included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Translator's note. Yang Jisheng's The World Turned Upside Down arrives with renewed attention to the Cultural Revolution at the 50th anniversary of its launch, and as China's president, Xi Jinping takes steps to enhance centralized power and to establish a Mao-style cult of personality. The only complete history of the Cultural Revolution by an independent scholar based in mainland China, The World Turned Upside Down makes a crucial contribution to understanding the Cultural Revolution and its lasting influence today. As a major political event and a crucial turning point in the history of the People's Republic of China, PRC, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, marked the heyday as well as the eventual bankruptcy of Mao Zedong's ultra-leftist politics. Purportedly to prevent China from departing from its socialist path, Mao mobilized the masses in a battle against what he considered to be the bourgeoisie within the ruling Chinese Communist Party, CCP. This 10-year-long class struggle on a massive scale caused unprecedented damage to traditional culture and to the nation's economy. To a great extent, it was the disaster of the Cultural Revolution that prompted post-Mao Chinese Communist leaders, ahead of their Soviet counterparts, to implement pragmatic economic reforms. Major policies that the post-Mao government has adopted may still be best understood as a reaction to the radical politics of the Cultural Revolution. The revolution was cultural because Mao conceived of it in Marxist terms as a thoroughgoing revolution aimed at eradicating old culture and customs and educating the masses through a series of political campaigns. Mao considered a populace with a revolutionized consciousness to be the best defense against the bourgeoisie taking power over the country. Although Mao's program achieved considerable success in destroying much of traditional culture, the Cultural Revolution also brought about a revival of China's imperial past in the widespread personality cult of Mao and the deification of the leader. The Cultural Revolution was political as well, since the pronounced main task of this movement was to purge capitalist roaders in the party leadership and strengthen the proletarian dictatorship under Mao. Even though some of the leaders thus named, such as Mao's first chosen successor, President Liu Shaoqi, took an approach less radical than Mao's to China's economic development, all of them were committed communists and had never designed a program, as charged, to restore capitalism in China. The Cultural Revolution had a far greater impact on the lives of ordinary people and on Chinese society in general than any other political movement in the history of the PRC. Large swaths of the population were demonized and persecuted as political enemies, especially those labeled as black elements: landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, and rightists, along with teachers, scholars, and artists whose work had to do with culture and education. A vast number of them were illegally detained, interrogated, tortured, and even brutally murdered or driven to suicide. The majority of government officials and party cadres were sidelined as capitalist roaders and sent to labor camps to undergo reform. Enthusiastic urban youths formed Red Guard and rebel organizations and served as Mao's crusading army against the traditional party and state establishment, before most of them, 17 million in total, were likewise sent to the countryside to be re-educated by peasants, crippling them for participation in the post-Cultural Revolution era of reform and opening. Factional violence among mass organizations throughout the country in 1967 and 1968 resulted in substantial military and civilian casualties that still remain uncounted, except for sporadic provincial and local statistics. According to official estimates, the total number of people affected by campaigns against political enemies amounts to 100 million, which was 1/8 of China's population at the time. Due to the Cultural Revolution's long-lasting grave impact on China's economy and national life, It is both officially and popularly referred to as 10 Years of Chaos. The post-Mao CCP leadership began in late 1976 to implement concrete measures to reverse Mao's Cultural Revolution policies in all areas. In June 1981, the central leadership adopted the Resolution on Certain Questions in the History of Our Party Since the Founding of Our Country, an attempt to review Mao's legacy and conclude a highly problematic chapter in the CCP history, so that both the party and the nation might be united, leave the past behind, and look ahead. While acknowledging the Cultural Revolution as the cause of the most severe setback and the heaviest losses the party, the state, and the people had suffered since the founding of the PRC, the resolution nevertheless upheld Mao Zedong thought as the guiding principle of the CCP, apparently out of concern that a thoroughgoing critique of the Cultural Revolution might put the legitimacy of the entire regime in question. The Cultural Revolution has therefore remained a highly sensitive topic in China, and important Cultural Revolution documents remain classified in Beijing's Central Archives, while serious independent studies of the Cultural Revolution, such as Yang Jisheng's, are invariably censored in mainland China. The Chinese edition of The World Turned Upside Down, 2016, was published in Hong Kong and cannot be legally sold or circulated in mainland China. Arriving more than a decade after the publication of official Chinese studies on the subject, such as A Concise History of the Cultural Revolution, 1996, by Xi Xuan and Jin Chuming, Turbulent Decade, A History of the Cultural Revolution, 1988, by Yan Jiaqi and Gao Gao, and Years of Great Turmoil, 1988, by Wang Nianyi, as well as Mao's Last Revolution, 2006, by Roderick McFarquhar and Michael Schoenhals. Yang Jisheng's The World Turned Upside Down has benefited from many memoirs, local histories, and commentaries published in the intervening years that offer a great deal of additional material and new thinking regarding the Cultural Revolution. Frank Decatur's recent The Cultural Revolution, A People's History, 1962 to 1976, 2016, also takes advantage of more recently unearthed material to offer the thesis that popular passive resistance and noncompliance led to the end of Maoism. Yang Jisheng, on the other hand, posits that the Cultural Revolution was a triangular game between Mao, the bureaucratic clique, and the rebel faction, and that the bureaucratic clique ultimately won. Mao lost, and the rebel faction bore the consequences of the loss. Yang, who has also written important works on China's reform and opening, the Deng Xiaoping Era, 20 Years of China's Reform and Opening, 1998, and Political Struggle During China's Reform Era, 2004, asserts here that reform and opening resulted from the ultimate victory of the bureaucratic clique, of which Deng Xiaoping and other reformers were key members, and that it is therefore essential to understand the mentality and practices of that clique in order to understand China as we know it today. Yang Jisheng rejects the official version of rebels running amok and departing from the original trajectory of Mao Zedong thought, finding instead that Mao fully intended to topple enemies in the bureaucratic clique who stood in the way of his envisioned utopia, already discredited during the Great Leap Forward and the Great Famine, while also forging a new man through political campaigns. Mao used the rebel faction to smash the old state apparatus, but then abandoned the rebels and restored the purged bureaucratic clique to attain great order after the nationwide chaos. While most Cultural Revolution histories and popular art and literature demonize the rebel faction, this book describes tragedies created by the bureaucratic clique that far exceeded those created by the rebel faction, in particular among ordinary people. Official Chinese histories claim that the adverse effects of the Cultural Revolution resulted from its being made use of by counter-revolutionary cliques, in particular those of Lin Biao and the Gang of Four. This book shows that Lin Biao and Jiang Qing merely supported Mao, and that the majority of so-called counter-revolutionary actions were carried out under Mao's leadership to push forward the Cultural Revolution. The book also points out that Liu Shaoqi, depicted in officially influenced histories as a docile victim of the Cultural Revolution, was initially a fully engaged participant in the power struggle at the highest reaches of government, and that Zhou Enlai, typically portrayed in a positive light as opposing the Cultural Revolution and protecting cadres, faithfully assisted Mao throughout the movement. As the translators of Yang Jisheng's tombstone, we once again faced the task of not only translating, but also editing The World Turned Upside Down, originally published at a length of 800,000 Chinese characters, to bring it within the acceptable length for publication in English. As with Tombstone, we benefited from Mr. Young's help in first going through the book and making cuts, including the removal of 3 chapters. In the translation process, our further edits were aimed at highlighting the material that best supports Mr. Young's thesis, reducing the amount of sometimes bewildering detail, and preserving material that is not replicated in other published works. It is our hope that the version presented here fully reflects Mr. Young's key points on this complex topic. The world of translation is notoriously underfunded. We are grateful for the confidence that Farrar, Straus, and Giroux has demonstrated in making this English translation of The World Turned Upside Down possible. We would also like to thank the Open Society Foundations for their additional and essential support. Author's Note. The Chinese writer Wang Meng once said, "Who can explain and furthermore summarize, politically and in terms of schools of thought, the 10-year Cultural Revolution that began in 1966? This is Chinese history, and the Chinese are duty-bound to correctly and unambiguously sum up the Cultural Revolution in all its aspects, not just for China, but for the sake of human history as well." This work that Wang Meng describes has long attracted me, and I hope that my exploration of this complex and dangerous terrain will make a difference. As a participant in the Cultural Revolution at Tsinghua University in 1966 and 1967, I traveled to a dozen or so cities throughout China for the Great Networking. In January 1968, I became a journalist for the Xinhua News Agency, and over the ensuing years I covered many incidents related to the Cultural Revolution. In both my personal experience and journalistic reporting, however, I missed the forest for the trees and lacked a comprehensive and in-depth understanding of this period of history. After I finished writing Tombstone in 2007, I turned to researching the Cultural Revolution. Although many general histories of the Cultural Revolution have been published, I decided to offer my experience and understanding of the Cultural Revolution's process for listeners' critical judgment. Researching the Cultural Revolution requires restoring the original features of history by transcending the limitations of that era and of personal interest and feelings, and standing on the high ground of human and political civilization. The official version of the Cultural Revolution is limited by its original ideology and political system, which inevitably contradicts historical truth. On June 27, 1981, the 6th plenum of the 11th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, passed its resolution on certain questions in the history of our party since the founding of our country, which became the blueprint for the official history of the Cultural Revolution. This resolution recounted and commented on recent history in accordance with what prevailing political conditions required and allowed, and was actually more of a compromise on the political problems faced at that time. Without it, China's great transformation through reform and opening over the next 30 years would have been impossible. However, restoring the truth of the Cultural Revolution prohibits historians from taking a middle course and compromising as politicians do. The resolution preserved the soul of the dictatorial system, and with it, the interests of the bureaucratic clique, by upholding Mao Zedong thought and distinguishing it from the thinking and theories Mao developed after 1956. This utilitarian pruning goes against historical truth and doesn't stand up under scrutiny. Official Cultural Revolution history also legitimizes the continued rule of the CCP by holding that the Cultural Revolution was internal disorder, erroneously launched by the leader and made use of by counter-revolutionary cliques, attempting to push responsibility for the Cultural Revolution onto the counter-revolutionary cliques of Lin Biao and Jiang Qing. and thereby remedy the crisis of confidence in the CCP. If these two cliques really existed, however, they rose and fell within the party. The official history of the Cultural Revolution and the books that have been influenced by it present Liu Shaoqi as a docile sheep, entirely subject to Mao's whims and finally sent packing down a road of no return. In fact, as a revolutionary who had experienced many battles and years of party infighting, Liu Shaoqi and the bureaucratic clique he represented resisted Mao right from the outset of the Cultural Revolution. After Liu Shaoqi was unseated, there was resistance to the Cultural Revolution faction through the February countercurrent and February suppression of counter-revolutionaries, and from a group represented by Deng Xiaoping, as well as even stronger resistance from the military bureaucratic clique. This series of resistances was not based on right and wrong, so much as on opposing interests, and ordinary people bore the brunt of these confrontations. Depicting Liu Shaoqi as a submissive sheep is an attempt to keep the bureaucratic clique from being held responsible for the Cultural Revolution, and to cover up the evil conduct of military and government bureaucrats that so devastated masses of ordinary people. Embellishing the image of Zhou Enlai and covering up his complicity with Mao during the Cultural Revolution arises from the same objective. Official history attempts to exonerate Mao by blaming the evil consequences of the Cultural Revolution on the counter-revolutionary cliques. But the Gang of Four didn't emerge until August 1973, after most of the veteran cadres had been restored to their posts. And if there was a Lin Biao clique, it existed from only April 1969 to September 1971. In any case, Lin Biao, Jiang Qing, and their respective groups merely pushed forward the Cultural Revolution under Mao's direction. Jiang Qing said, "I was Chairman Mao's dog, and whomever he told me to bite, I bit." Jiang Qing and Lin Biao were used by Mao, and the most they could do was to make use of the opportunities created by Mao to eliminate some of their opponents. After the Cultural Revolution was negated, senior party cadres wrote books and articles in which they professed to have adamantly resisted the Cultural Revolution all along. Left unmentioned were the periods when they played along, their persecution of other cadres and oppression of the masses, and their gloating over the misfortunes of their colleagues. Official histories amply cover the persecution of cadres during the Cultural Revolution, but barely mention or even distort the repeated bloody suppressions targeting ordinary people, the victims of which outnumber persecuted cadres by many hundredfold. History is written by the victors, and given that the ultimate victor of the Cultural Revolution was the bureaucratic clique, the sufferings of ordinary people have been largely ignored. The Cultural Revolution was an extremely complex historical process with multiple layers of conflict between multiple forces enmeshed in repeated power struggles and reversals over the course of 10 years, and a vast geographical space. All kinds of thinking, all types of communities, and all sorts of interest groups repeatedly clashed, but also became interwoven and bound together. The victors at one stage might become the losers at another stage. The people carrying out purges during one period of time might themselves be purged at another juncture. Thinking in black and white with simplified terms of endorsement or negation makes it impossible to record or comment on this complex historical process. Any reasonable thesis raised about the Cultural Revolution will be met with an equally reasonable rebuttal. Any historical account will be criticized by someone as one-sided, because most of the people who experienced the Cultural Revolution are still alive and well, and their different roles and situations during the Cultural Revolution gave them different perspectives and experiences. The criticisms of these participants are very valuable and push researchers ever closer to historical truth. But this invaluable resource for contemporary history presents its own difficulties. I'm a latecomer compared with others who have undertaken studies of the Cultural Revolution. Bringing up the rear has its advantages, in that I didn't have to start from scratch and could use the outstanding work of my predecessors as a point of departure. As I've read grand narratives of the overall history of the Cultural Revolution, memoirs by those who experienced it, in-depth research on key topics, histories of the Cultural Revolution in specific localities, and theoretical explorations, these names have become embedded in my memory. Gao Gao, Yan Jiaqi, Wang Nianyi, Xi Xuan, Jin Chunming, Roderick McFarquhar, Wang Youqin, Zhou Lunzuo, He Shu, Wang Shaoguang, Wang Li, Chen Xiaonong, Wu Faxian, Qiu Huizuo, Li Zuopeng, Xu Jianxian, Nie Yuanzi, Yu Ruxin, Liu Guokai, Xu Youyu, Song Yongyi, Hu Ping, Ding Shu, Guo Jian, Gao Wenqian, Gao Hua, Yin Hongbiao, Han Gang, Xiao Xidong, Ding Dong, Chen Yinan, Bu Weihua, Tang Shaojie, Qian Lichun, Zhang Boshu, Zhu Xueqin, Chen Huide, Wang Ruoshui, Wang Haiguang, Wang Xizhe, Wang Lixing, Yang Xiguang, Shu Yun, Ding Kaiwen, Xu Hailiang, Qi Zhi, Sima Qingyang, Zhou Ziren, Hua Xinmin, Ala Teng Delehai, Shi Namujila, Jin Guangyao, Jin Dalu, Li Xun, Dong Guoqiang, and Deng Zhenxin, among others. Even more valuable are some scholars who were willing to serve as stepping stones for other researchers as they quietly collected, edited, and sorted historical materials. Fu Sinian said that, in a sense, the study of history is the study of historical material. The editors of works such as the Chinese Cultural Revolution database, compiled by Song Yongyi, Ding Shu, Guo Jian, and others, Chronicle of Events of the 10-Year Cultural Revolution, compiled by Zhou Liangxiao and his wife, Gu Zhuying, as well as electronic collections of Cultural Revolution historical materials, such as Remembrance Yesterday and the Virtual Museum of the Cultural Revolution, have made a profound and indelible contribution. The years I spent researching and writing this book gave me the deepest respect for these forerunners in the field. Xu Youyu, Ding Dong, Bu Weihua, Yu Ruxin, Li Xun, and Cong Ziwen read the early draft of this book, while He Shu, Cai Wenben, Shu Hailiang, Wang Haiguang, and Song Yimin read parts of it. They all offered valuable feedback, for which I am deeply grateful. Preface: The Road, the Theory, and the System. In 1966 and the 9 years that followed, nearly every person in China became embroiled to some extent in the Cultural Revolution, an experience that left a permanent mark on the lives, fates, and souls of every participant. Even more profound was the movement's effect on China's politics, economy, and society. Mao Zedong originally expected the Cultural Revolution to last for at most 3 years. But as it proceeded, many unanticipated situations emerged. Mao never imagined the complete loss of control in August 1967 that would compel him to abandon some of the Cultural Revolution's staunchest supporters. He never imagined the irreconcilable struggle within the military ranks in 1968 would oblige him to cast away another group of allies. He hoped that the Ninth Party Congress would lead to a stage of struggle, criticism, transformation, never envisioning that a rift between him and Lin Biao would culminate in Lin Biao's shocking escape attempt and death in 1971. Right from the outset, repeated collisions derailed the Cultural Revolution from its initial objectives and left participants stranded. After the Lin Biao incident, Mao hoped to return the Cultural Revolution to its original direction, but by then, the movement had lost public support, and people had begun fastening their hopeful gazes on Zhou Enlai. That made Zhou the new target of Mao's revolution. One new problem followed another, and new errors were deployed to correct those that had come before. The Cultural Revolution was a 10-year process of feeling for rocks while crossing a river, and may have lasted even longer if Mao hadn't died in 1976. The Cultural Revolution was like a riptide resulting from the interaction of multiple forces, with each wave of turbulence swallowing up a new batch of victims and creating a new group of enemies. As the impetus of the Cultural Revolution faltered before growing resistance and the withdrawal of increasing numbers of people to the sidelines, the waves gradually ebbed until the Cultural Revolution failed and was thoroughly repudiated. With each surge of setbacks and struggles, ordinary people were churned and pummeled in abject misery, while Mao, at a far remove, boldly proclaimed, "Look, the world is turning upside down." I've used this expression as the title of my book to indicate the extent of this turmoil and suffering. The roots of the Cultural Revolution have to be sought in the system that existed in the 17 years before it began, and the prevailing ideology, and in the road Mao maintained at that time. The Cultural Revolution was a power struggle over the road China should take. Power was merely the tool for achieving a political path. Some researchers believe that the Cultural Revolution was a pure power struggle in which Mao sought to strip Liu Shaoqi of the prestige he'd gained by cleaning up the aftermath of the Great Famine. There's some truth in this view, but it doesn't entirely stand up under analysis. The entire process of the Cultural Revolution was packed with vicious power struggles from the Central Committee down to the grassroots. However, among politicians, power is a tool for realizing political objectives. In this case, China's political direction, i.e., whither China? Mao and Liu had long parted ways on this point, and each had established his own contingent of supporters. The leadership of the Chinese Communist Party was united on the basic question of taking the socialist road and achieving social justice with a comprehensive plan executed by the regime. But Mao and Liu disagreed on the conditions under which new democracy could transition to socialism and how quickly. Although Liu Shaoqi, like Mao, put an emphasis on class struggle, the targets of his struggle, i.e., criticism and denunciation, were landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, rightists, corrupt and degenerate grassroots cadres, and intractable intellectuals. Mao was the mastermind of attacks on all types of class enemies, but his main targets were within the party's upper levels, where China's direction was decided. The 3-year Great Famine undoubtedly intensified the divisions between Mao and Liu. Unreconciled to the failure of the 3 red banners, Mao was seeking a new opportunity to establish his utopia of total equality in the political, economic, and cultural spheres. Even if we allow that Mao's intentions were good, socialism as a form of collectivism is predicated on the obliteration of the individual and can be achieved only through the evil of coercion. For centuries, socialist ideals had been met with constant rebuff, but rather than recognizing the cause for this in socialism itself, Mao blamed it on revisionism and class enemies. Combating and preventing revisionism was therefore the chief task of the Cultural Revolution, as Mao tried to clear the way for establishing his utopia. That meant attacking capitalist roader power holders such as Liu Shaoqi, whose attempts to address the problems left over from the Great Famine by giving peasants more autonomy in growing crops and taking a softer line in international affairs were labeled a counter-revolutionary revisionist line. The path created by Mao had already created hell on earth in the Great Famine era, and the Cultural Revolution that Mao used to clear away obstacles for his envisaged paradise created yet another hell on earth. The ideology of the political road that Mao chose created a fanatical mass movement that meted out unprecedented brutality to the political underclass and individuals with alternative viewpoints. The Cultural Revolution was a massive movement that swept up the political underclass at the lower level and attacked the bureaucratic clique at the upper level. Every work unit, district, and family became embroiled in arguments. Married couples fought, fathers and sons became estranged, and the closest of friends parted ways. Mao's main tool for moving the masses, apart from his leadership position and supreme authority, was the ideology in which China's people had been steeped for the past 17 years, through textbooks, newspapers, meetings, and other means.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?